morning. Really excited to be here with you today to talk about a subject that is really dear to my heart, something I've been thinking about for a few years now. To start out, I want to share a couple of stories, actually 3 short stories with you, things that have affected me in my life. The first is about a young man named Nick. So when I was in high school, I was on the drum line, and I had a friend on the drum line named Nicholas. Nicholas got saved when he was about 16. He got involved with a local youth group because he was dating a girl who was in that youth group, and he became a believer at that point. About a year later, he was driving in his car late at night, and he lost control, went off the road, and slammed into a tree, and the accident ended his life. It was a real wake-up call for me and my friends. We learned a lot through that. So another young lady named Nancy that I knew in college. She was from Tegucigalpa, Honduras, and we got to know each other pretty well and became really close friends. She had become a believer when she was about 6 years old, and she had been living for the Lord since. And she was what I think of as kind of an example of a beacon of light, always talking to people and sharing hope and love with people that she came in contact with. When she was about 18, I believe it was her sophomore year in college, she caught some kind of virus, and it escalated, and it took her life. And that was a big, difficult wake-up call for me and a number of the people that knew Nancy. The third person I want to tell you about is a man named Billy. Billy Sherdell was my grandpa. And Billy became a believer when he was in his 30s. And his life changed from that point forever. He became very bold, speaking publicly to strangers, even singing to people that he had never met before about the Lord. In fact, my brothers learned not to go in public with him if that embarrasses you. They went to a barbershop once with him. I think I maybe have shared this story before, but they went to a barbershop with him once, and at the end, after he got his haircut, he stood up and sang a little hymn that he had made up and shared a verse to just perfect strangers in the barbershop. That's how he lived. He was just like that. So a few years back, he was alone in his house, and he had a heart attack, and he passed away. In his house, we found a scrap of paper, and on it, we think it was the last words he ever wrote, and it said, "My chains are broken, I've been set free." And at the end of the sentence, his handwriting sort of turned to scribble, and we think that's the moment that he passed. He died thinking about the Lord. He died thinking about what Jesus had done for him. He was faithful for about 40 years. Now, each of these I tell you for a particular reason, because I want to ask you a question that's going to lead our study today. And the question is this: who had the most opportunity to gain reward in heaven? Was it Nick, who had 1 year in which to do it? Was it Nancy, who had about 12 years in which to do it? Or was it my grandpa, Billy, who had about 40 years to do it? Do you know that Jesus actually tackled this big, difficult question in one of his parables? In fact, that's what we're going to look at today. It shows up in Matthew 20, verse 1 through 16. So let's take a look at what Jesus has to say about this interesting question. "For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard." Now, this is familiar to us because this kind of thing happens even today. If you got some project or some construction that you need done, or a ditch dug, or any sort of work, you can go somewhere in Marshall, Texas and find somebody that will do that work. Sometimes you'll find groups of guys on a corner who are willing to do some work. Sometimes you might go into a coffee shop and find somebody that's willing to work for you. You can find people to work for you almost wherever you go. And so this guy is a landowner, and he needs some workers. So he hits the town, and he goes into town, and he finds some, we're presuming men, but it could be ladies too, to work in the vineyard. Notice what happens. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into the vineyard. So this is what the pay is. Now, it's really important, just for those of you that are considering getting a first job. I'm looking over here. You want to know what they're going to pay and what you're going to be doing. So this has all of that implicit in it. So a denarius for the day. If you go to an employer and they say they'll give you a denarius for the day, maybe find another employer. But the denarius is not something we're very familiar with. So we're going to kind of have to break this down. So What he's basically saying is 12 hours of labor equals a denarius. Now, what I want to do is I want to give each of the people we encounter in this story names, just because it helps me kind of keep track of stuff. So let's call this group by the name Jim. So this is Jim and his buddies who got hired early in the morning, probably about 6 a.m. So they're going to work about 12 hours and they're going to get a denarius. Now, that's not something we're real familiar with. In Roman time, that was about the equivalent of like a day's labor or so. So I'm thinking if you work 12 hours and you were getting 15, 16, maybe 17 bucks an hour, that'd be about 200 bucks. It's a long day, but you get about that. So Jim's 12 hours of labor will equal about $200. Okay, so let's see what happens next. About 9 in the morning, so this is maybe 3 hours later, about 9 in the morning, that's the landowner went out and saw others standing in the marketplace doing nothing. And so this is important. This is going to be repeated a number of times. He's looking for these guys who are doing nothing because he wants to hire them. He told them, "You also go and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. I want you to notice this phrase right here. He says, "I'm going to pay you whatever is right." Now, if you have an employer that refuses to tell you what the pay is and just says, "I'll just pay you whatever's right," you're going to want to ask some more questions. But that's what this guy does. He says, "I'll pay you whatever is right." And they think, okay, well, that's fine. We'll go and work. So he tells them to go out, and they do it. So here's what we assume is going on. He says, "I'm going to pay you whatever's right," but he doesn't say a number. So we got to kind of do some math and take some guesses here. So if Jim is going to do 12 hours labor and he's going to get 200 bucks for it, that means that the next group, who's hired at about 9 a.m., is going to do about 9 hours labor. Let's call this group by the name Tom. So this is Tom and the guys. So Tom and the guys are going to work about 9 hours labor. Now, I bet there's someone in here that can do the math in your head. Anybody want to stab at it? Not bad, 150. Okay, so he's going to get about 150. Now that tells me you're tracking with me. So he's going to get about 150, we think. Now notice, the landowner didn't say, "I'm going to give you 150. He said, "I'm going to pay you whatever's right." But this is what we're assuming it would be because we know what Jim's going to get. So let's see what happens next. He went out again about noon and about 3 in the afternoon and did the same thing. Okay, this guy needs some real workers. I mean, he is just like, no matter how many he's getting, he feels like he needs more. So he goes out at noon, goes out at 3, and then you'll notice about 5 in the afternoon, he went out and found still others standing around. So he's looking for whoever he can get to work. I mean, he must have a harvest coming in or something. So he is just gathering up as many as he can get. So notice it's noon, 3, and 5. So this is 3 more groups of workers. And what it means is each of them is going to work a different amount because they're getting hired on at different points in the day. So notice how the conversation goes here with each of these groups. Now this is the landowner, asks them, "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?" Notice that phrase again, doing nothing. They're not working, they're just standing there. They're probably hoping to be hired, but they're doing nothing. Here's what they say, "Because no one has hired us." They answered. He said to them, "You also go and work in my vineyard." Now, this is really interesting to me because he asks them, "Why have you not been hired?" And they basically answer what he already knows, because no one's hired us. But there's something I think that they're kind of implying in this. It's that they're chosen last for a reason. And they're blaming it on the other employers. They're basically saying, well, nobody wanted us. Nobody wanted to use us. And so what's interesting about this is that we have our own experiences of being chosen last. I'll give you some of mine. When I was in PE, for instance, in junior high, you know where this is going. So we would play dodgeball, and the thing about kids is they remember who's good and who is not. And so if you've ever played 2 or 3 times, then when it comes time to choose teams, there's always going to be people chosen last. Now, I know I look like an NFL player now, but back then, I just didn't look that way. I looked like I wouldn't be able to play, and I proved I couldn't play. And so I was often chosen last. And so I relate to these guys. These guys are chosen last probably for some reason. Maybe they're a little bit more advanced in years. Maybe they don't have a lot of experience doing vine work. I mean, we don't know, but there's some reason they're chosen last. Now, they blame it on the other employers, but here's what I think is going on. When they say because no one hired us, I think they're basically saying we're willing to work, but other employers didn't see their value. So there's other employers around. This landowner's not the only guy that's hiring people. There's others, but they didn't want these guys. Doesn't tell us exactly why, but I'm going to say they're willing, but for some reason the other landowners or employers didn't want him. But what's so cool about this guy, he can use them. And I think that's a really beautiful message for us. It tells us something about God, that no matter who we are, we can be used. But more about that in a minute. So basically, they say that they haven't been chosen. Now, here's the big question in my mind, because we always want to know, well, what's the pay, right? What are they going to get paid? And so here, we already know, this is the one we know. We know Jim's going to get $200 for his 12 hours. We said Tom's going to do about 9 hours. He's going to about 150. And so about noon, it tells us that Sam came on. It's a name I made up, but Sam came on about then. So that's 6 hours. That's going to be about $100. And then Bill came on. He's going to work about 3 hours, him and his guys, and that's going to be about $50. And, poor old Fred. I mean, Fred came in last hour of the day. But here's the thing about Fred. Fred is going to do as good as he can do. He's going to work hard. He's going to do what he's told to do. But since he's only working 1 hour, I mean, he's basically doing the last hour of the day. We're going to assume he's probably going to get about $17 or so, about the charge for one hour. So this is what we expect, right? And remember, the landowner said, I'll pay you whatever's right to all of these guys. He said denarius for this. So we know this one. We're assuming all of these. So let's see what happens. When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last ones hired and going on to the first. Now, this is maybe a little bit different. You kind of expect the guys that got hired first to be paid first, but he kind of wants to flip the script a little bit, so he calls in poor old Fred first. So let's see what happens with poor old Fred, who worked hard, but, he was just sort of last to be chosen sort of a guy. The workers who were hired about 5 in the afternoon, so this would be Fred, came and each received a denarius. Now, when Jesus first said this, I think his audience went, oh, because they realized, something's going on. This is a twist in the story. You see, what we expected was for Fred to get a very small amount because he only was able to work about an hour. But here we find out he's getting the pay. You remember, denarius was for the whole day. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more. Now let me just show you on our chart what this looks like. So this is what we expected. We knew that he was going to get this, and so we expected these guys would get something like this. But then Fred lines up, and he gets his $200. Say, wait a minute, I thought Fred was only going to get 17. We were assuming wrong. And so now they begin to run the numbers. Each of them is thinking, if Fred gets 200, then I'm going to get more. And so they begin to make their own assumptions. So Bill's thinking, well, I did 3 times as much as Fred, so that would mean I get $600. Sam, 6 times as much as Fred, I'd get $1,200. And $1,800 for Tom, and that'd be $2,400 for Jim. That's like 2 weeks' wages. He could take a vacation, go to Jerusalem, and, I don't know, do whatever. He's going to get a lot of money. This is what he's thinking. He's thinking, wow, how exciting. I mean, imagine if you worked today and it's payday and you thought you were going to get like 12 times as much than you thought you were going to get, you would be really excited. So these next guys are excited. Fred's been paid. These guys are assuming this part. So let's see what happens. The workers who were right here. So when those came who were hired first, they expected to receive more, but each one of them also received a denarius. Dun, dun, dun. Ooh. Jesus, what are you trying to do here? This story is interesting. Okay, so the other workers, they expected to get this. They're thinking, we're about to make some real bank, but what happens is they all get that. He said, whoa, wait a minute. What is this landowner up to? What is this employer trying to do? Now, I have a personal story about this moment in this story, actually. When I was in youth group years ago, me and my brother were in the same youth group. He was a year older than me, and we were reading through these parables for our Bible study in our youth group time. And we got to this point in the story, and my brother, Lance, actually said aloud, well, that's not fair. And, I was thinking it, but I didn't say it. But then, right after he said it, the youth group leader kind of got onto him and griped at him and said, this is Jesus' words. You can't say they're not fair. And I was like, I'm glad I stayed quiet. But I was thinking the same thing. I was thinking, this is unfair. What is Jesus driving at here? But here's the thing. If you look at this and say, well, that does seem unfair, that's okay. I think that's what Jesus is trying to get us to do. He's trying to draw us in and catch our attention with something that's really surprising. He did this a lot. And so this is very surprising. It would have been surprising to the original audience. It's surprising to us that all of these guys are getting paid exactly the same, even poor old Fred. And so let's see what happens. Each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. Now, this is just natural. If this happened to you, you would probably grumble. You might even do something worse, like quit. So these guys begin to grumble. They begin to gripe. Let's see what they're saying. These who were hired last worked only 1 hour. This is what their big complaint is. They worked only 1 hour, they said, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work in the heat of the day. So basically what they're getting at is that Fred's 1 hour has been made equal to their 12 hours. So their complaint might look something like this if you're into math. It's that Jim's 12 hours is not equal to Fred's 1 hour, but the landowner has turned those 12 hours into something that's equal of Fred's 1 hour. This is a legitimate complaint. I mean, their complaint makes sense. Notice what happens here. But he answered one of them, this is the landowner speaking now, I am not being unfair to you. What's that word? Friend. Interesting. So Jesus, I think, puts that in there to remind us, this guy's not trying to take advantage of these guys that work for him. He's actually doing them a kindness by hiring them and giving them a generous wage in the first place. He calls them friend. So we know that he considers them friends. So he calls them friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Well, you got me there, employer. I sure did. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you. Now think for a second what's going on in Fred's mind over to the side. Jim is here complaining about how Fred got as much as I did, but Fred's over there thinking, I sure did. I'm going to work for this guy again. But Jim's frustrated, and rightfully so. So let's see what he says. So this is a landowner still speaking. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous? And then this is Jesus' commentary about the whole story. He says, so the last will be first, and the first will be last. Now, that's the end of the story. You probably were waiting for some kind of like big reveal where we realize that, oh yeah, this is, that does make sense, but then we get to the end of the story and it's like, it doesn't make sense still. I mean, Jesus, what are you driving at? And what we have to see is what all of this means. And so let me just kind of cap the actual story with this, because I think we have to acknowledge this. 12 hours being equal to 1 hour on earth, this is unfair. I'm not in any way saying that this is fair here on earth. This is unfair on earth, but I want to remind you of something that Jesus said at the very beginning of the story. Some of you probably remember, he says, for the kingdom of heaven is like. So note that Jesus here did not say, this is what the earth should be like. He didn't say, here's how employers should treat employees. Here's the pay scale manual for earth. He doesn't say that. What he says is, I'm going to teach you something about the kingdom of heaven. What that means is we have just gone into metaphor land. We have just stepped over into an analogy. That means that he's going to call things something that they're actually not. So he uses this hypothetical situation to teach something about the kingdom which is to come. So 12 hours equaling 1 hour on earth, this is unfair, but in the kingdom of heaven, it's fair. Now that still probably feels dissatisfying, right? You probably look at that and say, well, wait, math is math. Whether we're here or there or anywhere, math is math. That still feels unfair. And you might say, but why is it fair? Well, for that, we got to understand what the parable represents. So let me just show you this little phrase again, because there's a clue in this to what we're talking about. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers. Now, when we look at parables, and you've seen this in the last weeks actually, when we look at parables, when we see this kind of setup where you've got a landowner and workers, or you've got a nobleman and his servants, or you've got a king and his noblemen or whatever, what we got to recognize is that that usually represents believers. And so here, what we have is we have the landowner and we have his workers. So we're talking about believers. Now, in this particular parable, all of the workers were faithful. Now, there's other parables like the one we looked at last week where some were faithful, some weren't as faithful, some were kind of medium faithfulness. But here, think about all the workers. Even poor old Fred did as good as he could do. He did everything that he could to fulfill the job, just like Jim did everything he could do. The only difference was the amount of time they spent doing it. So they're all faithful, and that means they're faithful believers. That's who we're talking about in this parable. Now, in the parable, what we have is this kind of timeline. And throughout the day, the landowner goes and gets more and more workers as he goes along. He gets some at 6, 9, noon, 3, 5, and 6 p.m. And then at each one of these points, he gets more workers. And so they then work for the rest of the day. Now, the big question that we got to answer here is, what is this moment? What is this? I mean, if this represents faithful believers, then this is the moment that the faithful believer gets saved. So Jim is the name I made up, but this is Jim's salvation. And then after his salvation, he is faithful to the Lord. Now, that brings into question, what are these numbers? What do those represent? I mean, they're times of day, but if this entire thing represents an entire era, then these times must be times on a timeline. So I'm going to suggest to you that these are points in Jim's life, possible points. So 6 years, 26 years, 46 years, so on and so forth. So hypothetically here, Jim gets saved at 6 years old, and then he has a lot of years to follow the Lord. The next was Tom. Tom gets saved a little bit later, but he's still fairly young. He's 26, and so on and so forth. And so each of them is saved at a different point, which means that they have a different amount of time. And here's poor old Fred. Fred here, I love Fred. I mean, he lived a lot of years and just didn't really think about the Lord. But then at some point, it dawned on him. He became a believer, and it was just right toward the end of his life. He still came into the kingdom, and then once he was there, he was faithful just like everybody else. It just was a different amount of time. So what I want to do is kind of rearrange these. So this is the years after each of their salvation. So Jim had 60 years after he was saved. Tom had 40 years. Sam had 20 years. Bill had 10 years, and poor old Fred only had 1 year. All of them were as faithful as they could be. Now, I know in real life, we're probably not all 100% faithful. I mean, I'm not. If you guys are, I feel really bad. But we're probably not all 100% faithful. But for the simplicity of this lesson, Jesus just makes them faithful. So Jim's faithful, Tom's faithful, all of them are faithful for 100% of the time that they're saved. Now, I'm not really a mathematician, as you might have noticed. My skills lie somewhere else, but I like the idea of trying to break this down into some sort of math equation. So here's the best I could do. It seems like what he's saying is that 100% faithfulness divided by 100% of your saved years. So that means if you're 100% faithful for 100% of the years after your salvation to the point of your death, then what that means is that you're 100% faithful. I mean, it all kind of almost cancels us out in a way, that 100% faithfulness equals 100% faithfulness. I love algebra. Okay, so if Jim comes into the kingdom at this point, he becomes a believer, and then he lives 60 years, what that means is that 100% faithfulness for his full 60 years equals 100% faithfulness. And if poor old Fred comes in, right towards the end, but he's 100% faithful for that year that he's got, and that's 100% of the years he's got after his salvation, he's 100% faithful too. This begins to bring into focus how this seemingly inequality can actually be equal in the kingdom of heaven. Now, do you realize that this is actually not the only place that this concept is talked about? There's another little sentence that Jesus said in Revelation that I think kind of encapsulates the whole thing. So let me show you this phrase. Now, this is Jesus speaking to believers. This is not Jesus talking about how to get saved. This is not Jesus telling people about gaining eternal life for the first time, believing in Him. This is Jesus trying to encourage people who already are saved to be faithful. And there's this formula in the first part of Revelation where He offers these different kinds of rewards. And He says, if you overcome, and if you be faithful, then these are yours. Notice what He says here. He says, be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. Now, when we see crowns, we need to be thinking of reward. This is a word that represents the kind of reward that is waiting or can be waiting for you and me if we're faithful. Now, notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say, if you're faithful for 20 years, you'll get the pewter crown. It's nice, but it's it's a little soft. If you want the silver crown, you got to do 40 years, gold crown and the platinum crown, 50 years plus. I mean, he doesn't say any of that. But remember, he's talking to a group of people who are going to live a different amounts of time. What he says is, you be faithful until death. For one person, that's going to be 5 years. For another, it might be 10, it might be 20, it might be 30. He says the reward is based on your faithfulness, not on the amount of time that you have in which to be faithful. And so, that's the same kind of concept that we see here from this parable. That those who die 1 year after their salvation have as much opportunity to gain reward as those who die 60 years after their salvation. Now, this is a real big surprise for a lot of people. In fact, I talked to a guy in the foyer after the first service. He said, I didn't know either way what the answer was. And this came as a surprise. That someone who has 1 year in which to be faithful to the Lord can have the same amount of reward in heaven as a person who has 60, 70, however many years. What an incredible, exciting thing. And I think that's why Jesus told this parable and was teaching that that's what kingdom fairness is like. And you might say, well, why is that? Well, I want to remind you of the stories I started with. Nick, I know for a fact, did not choose to die at the age of 17. He would have lived till he was 80, 90. That's what he would have chosen. It was chosen for him by God that would be the moment that he passed. Nancy, I know for a fact, I remember sitting in one of the buildings in Laterno University talking about what she was going to do with her life. She told me she wanted to open an orphanage in Honduras, and she wanted to teach people to sing and to do music. She was very musical. She had a plan. She did not choose to die at the age of 18. That was chosen for her. The amount of time she had was chosen for her. Billy, he probably would have chosen to die the same day his wife died, because it was a very sad thing. He and his wife, my grandma Joyce, were together for a number of decades, and they talked to so many people about the Lord together. But in his case, God had him stay for another decade and a half. We don't choose the amount of time we have, and it makes me so happy to know that God doesn't consider that, because it's his choice how long we have. What he considers is how faithful we are in the time we have. So, who has the most opportunity to gain reward in heaven? I bet you could guess it. It's kind of a trick question. They each had an equal opportunity. And that's really exciting to me, that Nick, after 1 year, may enjoy the same eternal rewards as Billy had after 40 years of faithfulness. This is really exciting. This makes me happy. And I'll tell you what, that leads to our final kind of lesson for today, that you can be happier ever after by using the time he's given you today. It's so simple, right? It's nothing complicated. We don't need to know Greek to know this. We just need to be faithful with what we've been given. And most of what you've been given is your time. It's the one thing that you can't get back. Be faithful today with the time that he's given, and it's going to make you happier ever after. Well, before we pray, I want to tell you about a couple of things that I've got for you today. This is sort of a summary of the series that we've been in. And in fact, it's little out there. It looks big here. It's little. It's about like this. And it's on the tables out there. And what it has is the different lessons that we've gone through in this sermon series. So I hope you'll take one of those to help you remember what this sermon series has been all about. I brought another thing from my ministry to give to you as a gift that's out there as well. So I've written a book called Eternal Rewards, and it's out now, but I didn't bring those because that would make too much sense. Instead, what I brought was what we call our study guides, and this is a little threefold pamphlet that kind of condenses what's in the book down to a very easy kind of thing to look at. You can read the whole thing in just a couple of minutes, and so it's out there. Inside, it's got some graphics, and it's got a number of references to rewards passages in the New Testament. So if you're interested in kind of going deeper concerning eternal rewards, learning more about it, I think this would be a really great start. This is just grab a couple for free on your way out. I brought a few hundred so that you guys could have some. Finally, I want to tell you about what's happening next week because we're starting something new. The end of everything always begins with something new, and next week is going to be our something new. It's called 10. Now, I bet you could guess, but I'd just like to take a poll. Who knows what this sermon series is about? Who thinks they know? Ken knows. Okay, then I'm going to tell you. This sermon series is about the 10 Commandments. You may say, well, I already know the 10 Commandments. I could even quote them. I bet a lot of us in here are very familiar with it. I'm going to tell you, they're not what you think. In fact, we're going to learn some really surprising information about the 10 Commandments, how they apply to us, and how we can use them to live in a godly way. So I hope you'll join us for that. In fact, maybe bring a friend. It should be a really exciting series. Why don't we pray, and we'll dismiss. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you that of these lessons that you teach us, that we have an opportunity to gain eternal reward, not based on the time we have, but on the faithfulness we demonstrate. I pray that you would help us to remember that this week as we go out from this place and we try to share hope and love and life with the people that we love and meet. I pray, Lord, that you would come back this week like you promised, but if you don't, I pray that you'd bring us back safe here next week. In your name, amen.